Okay, everyone. Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining. I'm just gonna, oh, there we go. Before we begin the webinar, I would like everyone to be aware that we are simultaneously translating into French. Please look at the current slide for reference on how to choose your language. To walk people through the process, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. If you are choosing French, please, once you get onto the channel, as you can see, there's an option to choose English and French. If you decide to choose French, please also note that you have to, once you get into the channel, put a mute original audio on. And then our wonderful interpreter, Sonia, will take it from there. Also, in addition, we do have a translated slide deck in French that Isabel, my colleague who's helping manage the chat, who is on the call today, is going to post in the slide deck chat now. Please click on the link to access the French slide deck and follow along as we change slides. I'm going to give everyone 30 seconds to make any changes they need to get to the language that they need to be in. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you for bearing with us as we handle all of the admin pieces that come about during remote presentations. I would like to welcome everyone again to the Gender and Inclusion Responsive Emergency Food Security Training Program, Training Dissemination Webinar. My name is Alyssa Russo, and I am the GESI, or Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Program Management Advisor, sitting on the Program Performance and Quality team at Mercy Corps. I will be co-hosting this webinar with Laura Groggle, who is an external consultant working with Mercy Corps, and she'll introduce herself in a little bit. Laura developed, wrote, and piloted the curriculum, and we are very happy to have her here. Okay, so just to start, today's dissemination webinar will be approximately an hour and a half in length. Sorry, an hour in length, with 30 minutes of presentation and 20 minutes of question and answer. During the presentation, you will hear first about the conception of the curriculum and what the development and piloting period of the curriculum looked like. Then Laura will share some of the lessons learned and challenges she saw with the piloting of the curriculum. And finally, we will talk about the resources developed and connected to this training and how to use them. Just a quick note too, that for the question and answer period, like I mentioned earlier with the translated slide, we do have my colleague Isabel here on the call, and she will be managing the chat. So we request that you do put any questions you have in the chat, and she'll be able to compile them and then share them out during the question and answer session. And luckily enough, we do have Laura who speaks French. So if you do put a question in the chat in French, that works as well. All right, so let's get started. Just a quick disclaimer that this curriculum was made possible by the implementer-led design, evidence analysis, and learning, or in acronyms, IDEAL activity, small grants mechanism. The IDEAL activity works to support the United States government's goal of improving food and nutrition security among the world's most vulnerable households. It does this by addressing knowledge and capacity gaps within the food security community. In addition, this curriculum is partly based off of CARE's Global Gender Cohort Technical Training modules. Finally, as you can see on the slide, for more information on this curriculum that will be presented today, please do reach out to either myself or Maimuna Tolliver, who is the Senior GESI Advisor at Mercy Corps and works with Laura and I very closely on this grant, and she is also on the call today. And you can see our contact information is on the slide. So the idea for the training curriculum originally came to the Mercy Corps team after talking with country and technical support teams and deciding there was a need for more focused step-by-step guidance on conducting GESI analyses during emergency programs, particularly food security. In addition, the team noticed that there was a lack of understanding on how the results collected from an analysis were then integrated into the design and implementation stages of a program. And this also included the monitoring and evaluation and learning phase. Once the need for this resource was seen, the team realized that it would be a good fit for the program improvement small grants program that IDEAL had just launched. The Program Improvement Award, which is part of the Small Grants Program, called for applications to develop tools that contributed to improved design, implementation, and overall effectiveness and efficiency of food and nutrition security programming. Through this program, we were able to receive funds to develop the curriculum that we will present today. This curriculum aims to train food security and emergency program implementers on how to ensure a program is GESI, gender equality and social inclusion, responsive. It is also worthwhile to mention, and I know that Laura will mention this in her section, that many pieces of this curriculum can be used to train implementers on components of a GESI analysis in development contexts as well. All right, so once the grant was awarded, we began to develop the grant team. On the Mercy Corps side, the team consisted of myself and Maimuna Tolliver, who is again the Senior GESI Advisor for Mercy Corps. Both of us acted as managers as well as GESI technical experts. It also consisted of Laura Goggle, who is co-hosting this with me. She was hired pretty much from the start of the award to develop the curriculum and pilot it in conjunction with us. We decided to include the consultant in the grant because we needed someone who had very specific skills focused around gender equality and social inclusion and emergency food security, as well as someone who could be fully devoted to the curriculum. In addition to our small grants team, we had support on both the MEL and food security side from senior Mercy Corps advisors. Just to understand the timeline that it took to prepare and pilot the curriculum before I hand it over to Laura, I wanted to go over this slide. So the first step in the implementation of the grant was to develop and review the curriculum, which took a total of 3 months. Laura developed the curriculum in conjunction with Maimuna and I talking to her. And then Maimuna and I reviewed the curriculum pretty much as Laura wrote it from the technical GESI side. For the technical review for MEL and food security, this happened after the first draft. The curriculum was complete. The next stage of the implementation was to prepare for the pilot, which also happened simultaneously to curriculum development. So the pilot preparation period, took a total of 2 months and involved developing communication around the pilot and putting a call out for participants. With the call out for participants, we specifically requested team members who worked on implementation, were focused on emergency programming, and had a planned GESI analysis. It is also important to note that we did not require participants to have a GESI background because we wanted to make sure that this curriculum could be used and trained out by non-GESI experts. Once we had the participants selected, the 2-month piloting period began, which Laura pretty much ran. During the pilot, feedback was gathered from participants after each module, and a pre and post test were conducted to see the efficacy of the training. Laura will go into more detail about that in her section. And after feedback was collected, it was incorporated back into the curriculum by Laura, and Maimuna and I did a final review. So that's just a little bit of an understanding of the timeline of the pilot of the curriculum and the piloting period. Now I will pass it over to Laura to discuss the content of the curriculum and her process.
Thanks, Alyssa. And hello, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. My name's Laura Grogel, and I'm a GESI consultant, have been working as an individual consultant for about 6 years. I do have a background specifically in technical advising for gender and food security programming. And I also have been fortunate to have led the design as well as the data analysis for a number of gender analyses, GESI analysis, gender and youth analyses, kind of the evolution of the gender analysis world. And so I had a lot of lessons learned to draw from. And then I also have had experience working in humanitarian contexts. And so I was able to also try to put that lens kind of ground in the real constraints of that type of context. Before I begin, I just wanted to really thank Alyssa and Maimuna for their ongoing support throughout the process, their technical expertise, and their patience. It was a lot of back and forth, a lot of collaboration, and a lot of discussions on the best way to really make this a useful curricula. And I really appreciate their support, and we couldn't have done it without one another. So thank you to you guys. So yeah, I wanted to start with a high-level review of the curriculum contents. We decided to design the curricula using 4 modules. And some modules had 2 parts or 2 sessions, and others had 1. So it was a total of 7 sessions over 4 modules. The first module was really this basic foundations, the foundational concepts around gender equality and social inclusion. We had some exercises on reflection on gender norms, on socially excluded groups. We had also reflection and discussions on unconscious bias, all kind of the foundational concepts that we really wanted to make sure participants were on the same page before we really went into the more technical discussions on how to conduct a GESI analysis. We expanded this to be 2 sessions, partly because of feedback and the pilot process, and just because, like Alyssa said, the idea was that this could be rolled out for non-GESI specialists. And so we really thought it was important to dedicate significant time to these foundational concepts. The second module is all about gender equality and social inclusion integration, and specific to emergency food security programs. So what is that? What is the definition? What does it look like in food security programs? Why is it essential? What is the evidence telling us? And there are some case studies in there as well, looking at the importance of integrating GESI into emergency food securities, and then looking across the gender continuum, GESI continuum, as we adapted, to see where the participants' projects would fit. And then module 3 and 4 is really where we get into the bulk of the GESI analysis process. And later on in the presentation, I'll share with you the steps and how we kind of broke out the process. But essentially, module 3 is going through, well, first of all, key definitions of what a GESI analysis is, what are the steps, what's the preparation, what do tools look like. We had a bunch of case studies to practice kind of what we learned. And then module 4 is a continuation of that, but looking at really what happens post data collection or post-lit review in a GESI analysis. So looking at the translating of findings into recommendations and recommendations into activities, and then if necessary, activities into indicators, and integrating results into MEL plans. So that is the high-level curricula contents. I wanted to mention that each session was around just under 3 to 3.5 hours. We thought that for an online curricula, that was the maximum amount of time we thought was efficient and a good use of participants' time, as well as taking into account that the majority of participants are joining from emergency context and have a lot on their plates already. So next slide, please. Yeah, I wanted to discuss the piloting period generally. So we decided to pilot one session per week. And that meant that we had a session on a Tuesday morning. And then we had what we included per session as a virtual online office hours. So what this looked like is we'd have our session on a Tuesday morning, or depending on the time zone, it could be in the afternoon. And then after the session, we would assign an optional learning activity or homework assignment that really practiced some of the key process or terms in a participant's free time. And then the virtual office hour was held that Friday to allow participants to come in and discuss the learning activity and or discuss any content from that week's session that was unclear, anything that they wanted to discuss, even troubleshooting some GESI related issues in their own programs. So it was kind of a full spectrum of different things that happen in the virtual office hours. And like Alyssa mentioned, we had a pre and post test administered. We had an average score increase of nearly 30% percentage points between the pre and post period. And then we had module evaluations done after each module was completed to kind of get feedback during the pilot stage to understand what went well and what needed to be refined for the final version. And then at the end of all 4 modules, we had a final evaluation looking at participant satisfaction, where we saw a score of 4.5, 4.5 out of 5. Next slide, please. Yeah, before I go into kind of what an agenda from a sample session looks like, I wanted just to mention a couple of things of what made this training kind of different from previous trainings focused on gender or GESI analyses. I think the first one, and this can be seen in other curricula, but we were very deliberate about making sure that it wasn't necessarily a GESI advisor that was the target audience for this, that it could be someone with, an interest in gender or GESI, a focal person who necessarily hadn't had the opportunity to receive a full training. Or to have some technical background in GESI. So we really tailored it to that audience. And we really also made sure that all of our activities, the examples, the discussion points were really tailored towards food security programming, as well as like the emergency humanitarian context. So we had a lot of adaptation specific to that. We had to specifically update like definitions to include the gender equality and social inclusion bit, which has many of you know, been kind of recently added to the gender technical world. So we spent a lot of time wordsmithing and making really clear definitions for what is GESI, how do you define gender equality and social inclusion as a complete package? What is a GESI analysis? How would we define that? When we're looking at, the gender integration continuum, how can we also ensure that the socially marginalized groups are also included in that kind of analysis? So we had a lot of discussion on how to kind of integrate the social inclusion aspect into the definitions that have been used. And then, like I said, we really tried to focus on all adult learning principles and integrate a number of case studies and practical exercises into it, which is time consuming to develop and frankly necessary for this type of training because not everyone has had the opportunity to be part of a gender or a GESI analysis team. And all of the case studies and the practical exercises that we included are specific to like an emergency food security program as much as possible. And then the last thing, which I'll discuss in more details in a future slide, is that we really wanted to have something that was relevant for the emergency sector. And so we expanded upon the IGWG gender analysis table and the guidance for that table as kind of the basis or the bedrock of the training, meaning that we developed a table that could be used for data synthesis or data analysis, formulation of what a GESI barrier is in the context, what a GESI opportunity is, and translating that into a recommendation. The idea is that this table, which I'll go into more depth in a few minutes, can absolutely replace like a 35-page GESI analysis report, which some development programs may require, for example. But in an emergency context, maybe there's a lack of time or a lack of resources to really delve in and write a long report. So we wanted to make it as simple as possible for the teams working in that context. So then I just wanted to show you what generally one of the sessions would look like, the agenda. So this is from our module 2, I believe. And what is seen in the facilitator's manual is a breakout by timing. So every session started with an introduction as well as the learning objectives for that particular session. And then we usually would always spend about 5 to 10 minutes reviewing the materials from the previous session. We then would spend about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on the activity, discussing the learning activity or the homework that was given in the previous session and letting participants share out comments or experiences or any questions. And then we would dive into the content for that module specifically. And the last thing I want to mention here is that we would always end each of the sessions with a close, time for question, and then again, a presentation of the assigned learning activities for that session. Next slide. I'm not going to go over all these steps, but I wanted to let you know that we also modules 3 and 4 were based on 12 steps that we kind of adapted for conducting a GESI analysis. And each step we stipulated a level of effort or number of days that would probably match what an emergency food security program would look like. The idea was that the 12 steps is really like the full process, and we gave a lot of examples of how the full process would likely need to be amended for an emergency context, or steps that could be combined, steps that could potentially be removed if there's time or budget constraints. But the idea was that we wanted to have the full 12 steps. So as Alyssa had mentioned, it could also be relevant for a program wanting to undergo a full GESI analysis that ends in a 35-page report. But modules 3 and 4 cover all of the 12 steps and the adaptations that are possible in a different context. Next slide. And I just wanted to go over again, this is the table that we use kind of throughout the training, and it's adapted from the IGWG gender analysis table. And it's we adapted it specifically for the framework that Mercy Corps uses, the domains that Mercy Corps uses in their GESI analysis. And we tweaked the language, and then we also gave very specific directions, maybe a little bit more in depth than what you would find in the IGWG session plan for how you fill in the columns, how you understand the different concepts that are here and presented. So just very briefly in column A, this would be where you would be inputting some themes that are coming out either from your lit review and your primary data collection. And then based on the column A, then you would pull out what we define in the training as a GESI-based barrier, and we give lots of examples. And then column C is you would pull out what you would identify as a GESI-based opportunity, and then would align very specifically recommendations to what you've pulled out in column B and C. I wanted to mention 2 additional things for this table here. And the first is that because we were really wanting to make it relevant for the humanitarian or emergency context, we added not a domain necessarily, but an area that needs to be analyzed in this context, and that it relates to safety and security, because we know in times of emergency or humanitarian crisis, GESI-related safety and security issues are very critical. That could include things like an increase in violence against women and girls, an increase and exclusion of ethnic minority, et cetera, et cetera. And so we added that to be more relevant also for the emergency context. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that we, in the training and in the curricula, we really made it very clear that if you are operating under a specific project, it's really crucial that you keep your analysis highly aligned and highly, I would say, tight to the project objectives, so that you're not going over all of the GESI themes by domain in the country that you're working or the region where you're working, but you really hone in on what are the GESI themes relevant to your project objectives. And you can't see that in the table as captured here, but we discussed that thoroughly in the training. Next slide. So I just want to discuss some of the challenges that we experience. When you're working with a pool of interested people who have a GESI analysis plans, we had a mixed bag of people that maybe had very little exposure to GESI, and then we had some very highly experienced GESI advisors who could have easily taken the curricula and also piloted the training. So it was an excellent group, and we had a lot of excellent sharing of experiences, but it also made it difficult to really tailor to the specific audience. And then I think I've mentioned a little bit how we really were trying to push forward the definitions of what GESI is, since that is kind of a new and emerging way that the sector is going. But on the same side of that is that in the kind of realm of humanitarian development programming, I think we don't have a deep bench of social inclusion specialists. And so kind of pulling out what that means and how do we gain more expertise and knowledge in that area was an issue. It's an issue generally, but it was also an issue for our participants and NSME as well. And then the last thing is just this virtual world that we're living in, time and language differences was a challenge, as always. Next slide. And I think our lessons learned was we adjusted based on the pilot feedback. We primarily adjusted the timing of things, and we took out extraneous activities primarily to allow for sufficient time to cover really the basics and the key concepts, which is all of module 1 and 2 essentially. And that's just was really important to us to make sure that we could have a foundational common understanding of kind of why we're doing this and what are the key definitions. The other thing I wanted to mention is that initially when Alyssa and Maimuna discussed the virtual office hours, it was the type of thing where you're like, okay, I guess, I'll do that. But in my mind, I'm thinking who's gonna come to the virtual office hours? But really it was a highly attended activity. People were really engaged. They came with excellent questions, with excellent experiences to share. And I would encourage anyone who's interested in using this curricula to consider an aspect of virtual discussions beyond what's scheduled in the session plans. And then I think generally and those of you who have been engaged in such processes, you might agree, but we really needed to strike a balance between the technical knowledge that you would need to know and like how to do the analysis for GESI versus how to lead a GESI analysis, which is more like operations and management. And we wanted to really cover both of those things because a lot of times maybe a gender focal person would need to know, the key concepts in the process, but wouldn't necessarily need to like be able to pull out the GESI barriers and opportunities, on the top of their minds. They might engage with a GESI expert in headquarters or maybe a short-term consultant. But so we really wanted to include useful information that could allow people to understand, like, what are the operational things, like what kind of logistics do we need to be aware about? So we did a lot of discussions about, how do you get together a small GESI team? What are the steps to getting your team buy-in? We had a sample work plan. We discussed budget. We discussed all of kind of the operational and management things that are involved in that. The other lesson learned, and this goes back to like the technical knowledge that one might need if they're leading a GESI analysis, is, it was difficult to go over like a qualitative methods like in depth, and it's a very complicated subject, as you know, and something that I think isn't done so well in development generally. So this is maybe a weakness of the curricula, but it wasn't also the focus of it. But we didn't have a lot of time to go into like qualitative methods and what that looks like in a perfect world. We did discuss a lot of the constrictions in the humanitarian emergency context to having like a really sound qualitative sampling, for example. But this is an important aspect that we didn't have time for. And then the last lesson learned is I think there was maybe differing opinions on who is responsible in a project team for leading a GESI analysis. Is it the GESI focal person? Is it a male team member? Is it a GESI advisor or a GESI consultant? And so just clarifications from organizations who want to roll out this training internally, I think would really be useful. Next. And using the curricula. So we suggest really identifying participant cohorts with similar levels of exposure to GESI. Like we said, it's absolutely something that can be picked up and used with non-GESI experts. But if you have different cohorts with people of varying levels of GESI, it can allow you to go into more depth in certain areas where it's needed and other areas less so. So just something to be aware of. Another cohort example could be if you know that this team is planning on leading the GESI analysis process, like technically, versus a team that's going to lead the process kind of operationally or logistically, and you can kind of tailor a little bit the curricula to that as well. And then, as Alyssa mentioned, they did this, and I think it's so crucial to adult learning practices, but if possible, really working with different groups of participants who have immediate or upcoming plans to conduct a GESI analysis, including the necessary budget, so that they can really start to apply and practice what we're facilitating in the training setting to their actual work. And then we made it so it's easy to adapt the learning activities to like an upcoming GESI analysis that a team member is planning. And then just logistically making sure you're setting dates far enough ahead of time to maximize participation. And there might be some preparation that you need to do in regards to the case studies if you want to look them over, and if you want to maybe adjust some of the languages or the examples to be specific to your country or the region in a certain country. It's not necessary, but it could be something that elevates, I think, participant kind of exchanges on that. And then the last point I wanted to say, and I think Alyssa said this earlier, is that we really made it so that portions of the training could be standalone, or that you could do the training over a 3-month period, or if you wanted to have a really intense week and a half long training, you could also do it like that. But really we are hoping that, for example, module 1, if you want to have a general GESI and food security training, you could take aspects of module 1 and deliver that to your team members. So there's a lot of potential for standalone use as well. Next slide. And over to you, Alyssa.
Yes. So thank you so much, Laura, for walking us through the content of the curriculum, although there's so much to learn in the curriculum. So I know you were able only to go through a small portion, but thank you so much. Finally, we can move on to I want to make sure that everyone is aware of the resources that will be available. So the full curriculum will be available for use, which does include the facilitator manual with detailed session plans with annexed agendas, learning activities, and answers to activities. The participant manual to counter the facilitator manual, as well as the PowerPoint slide decks for each of the 4 manuals. There's 7 because they're broken up into 2 sessions for most of them. The curriculum, in addition, is also being translated into French, and that translation will be available for use as well. All of these materials will be up on both Mercy Corps' intranet, which is the digital library, as well as the Food Security Network in the spring, and when completed and after reviewed by the donor for the grant. And just very quickly, I did want to pass it over to Sahara Al-Nouri, the Mercy Corps Senior Director of Gender Equality and Social Inclusion, to put a very quick call out to the Gaia program, which is an Ideal Associate Award and closely connects to this curriculum. Sahara, do you want to say something about that?
Thank you so much, Alyssa, and hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I just wanted to take this opportunity with this audience in particular to make sure that everyone knew that Ideal's newest associate award, which is called Gaia, or the Gender and Youth Award, launched in the fall. And the Gaia program is going to have a focus on learning around gender and youth and food security in both humanitarian all the way through to development spaces. And so the team and program are just in sort of the launch stages right now, but I just wanted to mention it to this audience and to say stay tuned, because there will be more opportunities for learning and gathering and tool sharing related to gender and youth integration in food security programs in the future. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there. And if anyone has questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me about that. I'll throw my email into the chat. And thank you so much, Alyssa and Laura, for this presentation. I can see there are quite a few questions popping up in the chat, so I will stop there so that we can get into some of the good discussion from our participants. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sahar. And we are at question and answer. We're going to spend the next 25 minutes or 20 minutes going over question and answer. I'm going to stop sharing the slide deck. And Isabel, can you go ahead and read the first question?
Yes. So our first question is from Karine Garnier, and she says, in which EPs was the training piloted in?
And so, sorry, Karine, I'm just going to clarify. In which emergency programs was it piloted in?
Yes, I think that's what she refers to, yeah.
So, and I'll let Laura talk in a second, but so what we did when we decided to pull out the participants was we put a call out for participants who were focused, who were implementing in emergency programs. And so I do have the list of people. We were pretty specific, Maimuna and I, to look at, we wanted to make sure that it was regionally, across all of the regions that Mercy Corps works in, which is pretty much across the globe, as well as a couple of different gender dynamics that we had, or sorry, not gender, sex dynamics for male and female. So it was across a number of different emergency programs. I have the list and I can share it out in the chat, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
Yeah, I could just mention that there was a lot of like BHA funded projects, as well as the Canadian, the GESI funded. So those were the donors. I think there was also, there were some development practitioners as well, like, oh gosh, the school feeding program. There's some, yeah, but primarily BHA and GESI funded programs were represented. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Noshaba Safar says, were participants of training able to apply this framework during training with any given scenario? And then a follow-up from Leah Berkowitz that says, yes, can you speak a bit more to the learning activities between the sessions?
Yeah, sure. So I'll go with the first question related to the framework. Yeah, so the majority, I think, of the learning activities in the second half of the training were focused on using the table that we adapted. So we had a lot of practice with identifying domains in a general text. We had learning activities that asked participants to find a relatively recent GESI or gender or social inclusion specific analysis in their context, and review and then synthesize or take out data points by domain that were relevant for their project objectives. And then we had like a case study that could be like considered like notes from a couple focus group discussions that were all in one document, where participants then would identify what they would consider both along the domains, and then also something that could be constituted as like a GESI barrier or opportunity. And then we had also an in-session practical exercise where I had a list of GESI barriers and GESI opportunities from a sample GESI analysis that they then would brainstorm in small groups what a recommendation could potentially be. So yeah, I think the bulk of the learning activities, to get to the second questions, were around how to use and apply that table. For modules 1 and 2, modules 1 were kind of like the key foundational concepts. So we had an exercise of like internal reflection on one's own social identity. We had a number of activities kind of at that internal reflection point. And module 2, the learning activity, was looking at the GESI or gender integration continuum and looking at the activities in their project's work plan and trying to classify their activities along that continuum, and maybe have a discussion with their colleagues on where opportunities to move from neutral to more responsive. So that kind of answers those 2 questions, I hope.
Yes, next one is from Chloe Bass and says, thank you for the presentation. I see that this curriculum was specific to EFSPs. Can you speak a little bit about the distinctions that you included in this for emergency programming as opposed to longer term development programming?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. I think the majority of like the case studies and practical like learning activity that we use were like from the Emergency Food Security Program. But what I failed to mention in the presentation, which I think is one of the huge advantages to the curricula when you'll see it, is that there's a number of annexes in the facilitator guide. And each annex is, for example, a list of illustrative GESI analysis questions for emergency food security programs, or illustrative GESI analysis tools that would need to be adapted for emergency food security programs. So a lot of tools have been developed in the annexes of the curricula that are specific to emergency food security programming. And the other point I wanted to say is that we really, the focus of the conversations and the participation of participants was based on like, okay, this is the Cadillac version of what a GESI analysis is. We're focusing on what we think, how this Cadillac version can be adapted to your context, what's feasible. And so we had a lot of input from the participants of the real constraints coming from their work on their projects, and then how we can adapt the steps to meet those constraints, and what does honestly good enough look like in this context, because a lot of them are facing real challenges. And then the last thing I'll say in that regard is that's why we decided to focus the training on having like a table as the final deliverable versus a 35-page report, because in these contexts, A, nobody has resources to pay a consultant to do that. B, nobody has their own time to write a 35-page report. And C, it's hard enough to get people to read it in the development context, and in the emergency context, I'm not sure, getting people to read a 35-page, 40-page report is something that we want to have to fight to do. So the bulk of the training was about a smaller but useful and concise deliverable that can be applied to emergency contexts.
Yes. Next one is, does this framework covers GBV, as GBV is one of the critical aspects to look at while conducting GESI analysis?
Oh, that's such a good question. I want to see who asked.
It's from Rashaba Safar.
Yeah, thank you. And I think both Alyssa and Maimuna are probably, we discussed this so much because GBV is such an important sector area, as you mentioned, in this kind of context. And yet we didn't have sufficient time to go in depth, but we do definitely address gender-based violence. We give additional resources for like minimum standards, and we discuss do no harm. And we did focus a lot on the aspect of protection and confidentiality and do no harm in the data collection process, if data collection is necessary. So we do focus it on that lens, but it's not, because it is more training for generalists and not like gender or justice.
C'est une formation pour les généralistes, c'est pas nécessairement pour ceux qui ont de l'expertise sur
do really encourage it to be considered in that safety and security additional analysis component that we included, but we strongly encourage participants, if that's a major issue that comes out in the lit review, for example, them to engage a GBV expert in the design or even kind of the ethical procedures of data collection. And then we did also, last thing, it's a little bit sporadic, but last thing, we did talk about like resources that you should look into if GBV is a major issue in the area you're working, because of a potential for participants in a focus group discussion to give accounts of violence that they've witnessed or that they themselves were a survivor to, and so that there's particular protocols and ethical issues that need to be considered. So really appreciate that question, because that's something we discussed internally a lot, and we do address it. But I think in scenarios where gender-based violence is a big issue, engaging someone with expertise in that area is really crucial.
Another question about the curriculum is from Madeline Shahagun. Says, does the curriculum consider disability inclusion as perhaps part of the social inclusion component?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Madeline. Yeah, and that's part of the, we had a lot of discussions on how to define social inclusion, because it is something that's gotten tacked on to our gender equality kind of technical area. And there's some misconceptions about what it is and is not. But yes, absolutely. Any socially marginalized identity, depending on the context, was included in that. I mean, with the caveat that it's really difficult to do an analysis on every single identity that potentially could be socially excluded. We discussed a lot about the drawbacks of that, and what are some ways forward to kind of address that. But absolutely, depending on the context or the target beneficiaries or participants of that project, that is absolutely something that would need to be part of the analysis.
And there is call outs to that. Sorry, there is call outs to that throughout the curriculum that Laura put in, and that we made sure that we had, even though we are ourselves not experts in that field.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have 2 more questions for now. One is from Chelsea Acevedo, and she says, if a team with no gender specialists wanted to do this GESI training, could it be done self-led, or do you think an expert facilitator is necessary for success? And similarly, could this same team conduct the GESI analysis without this training, or is it necessary for accurate and meaningful results?
Well, that's a really good question. I love people like Chelsea who have this desire to improve their programs from a GESI lens. So, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always encourage, I think any level of an analysis of GESI is better than nothing, right? That's always what I say to people. Of course, you want to be thoughtful of, if you're actually doing primary data collections, whether it's necessary and what are the ethical considerations about data collection. But one thing that we've really talked a lot about in the training, and I'm going to say it here because I feel very strongly about it, is that a GESI analysis does not necessarily have to include data collection. It really doesn't, especially more and more. There's so much good resources out there. There's so many different actors doing GESI analyses. All your partner organizations are doing them when they're going for the same pool of funding, and so if you're the best way to start, I would say, is to reach out to your contacts and see what they've done and read and see if that could potentially fill your purpose. But no, I think if you look at the facilitator guide yourself, you read it thoroughly and you kind of do the learning activities on your own in the participant manual, I think that would give you a really good foundation to either lead a training with your colleagues and or lead a kind of a rapid GESI analysis yourself. Yeah, so I don't think it's necessary. I would always encourage you to engage whatever GESI advisors you have, even if it's at the regional or headquarters level, because I think they're there to support you in these processes, especially. But yeah, I think you can take the manual and take the participant manual and work through it at your own pace, and then have a decent foundational knowledge on how to conduct something like this. And start with a lit review. Start and maybe end with a lit review, depending on where you are.
Another question from Rashava is, do you recommend that this training can be helpful to conduct GESI analysis for other sectors and not specifically EFS?
Yeah, I do. I think the case studies would need to be adapted because the case studies were specific to emergency food security programming. So it will be a little less useful, but the analytical framework, which is like the underpinning of a GESI analysis and the in-depth discussion and practice we have with the different domains of analysis, is going to be useful for every sector. And that's really the core knowledge. I think if you have a good foundational knowledge of what GESI is, you can go right to modules 3 and 4 and get a strong knowledge of what the GESI analysis domains are and apply that to a sector other than emergency food security programming, for sure. And then there's tools out, there's lots of GESI tools out there for different sectors. So I would encourage you just to look at what's out there for your sector as well.
Another question from Noshaba is, at any stage of the discussion and learning activities, was there any discussion on inclusion of LGBTI+ as they're one of the groups excluded and marginalized?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thank you for this question. And we had a lengthy discussion on that in module 1. We talk about different sexual orientations and gender identities quite a lot. And actually, interestingly, like, because it was a global cohort, there was such different exposure and levels of acceptance, frankly, for this discussion. And it was so rich. And the office hours from that module, I would say, were dominated by discussions on the issues of LGBTIQ+ communities and what that meant and why did we bring it up, and I think it's really important. I mean, yes, I completely agree. It's a major socially excluded and marginalized group that is often they're under receiving the development and humanitarian funding, and we did discuss it. The reality is, in the majority of contexts where donor money is going, it's such a taboo and difficult subject that we didn't probably discuss it and go into depth as much as we could have or should have. And maybe we can push our donors to make that more explicit in their calls for funding as well. But yeah, absolutely, there was a discussion of that. And some were very open and willing to look at that group in upcoming GESI analyses. Mm-hmm.
I do want to say,
go ahead.
Sorry, Isabel, I just want to take a moment. Martin messaged me directly with a French question, and unfortunately, I don't speak French, and I can't copy and paste it. So Martin, do you want to speak your question, and then Laura, who does speak French, can repeat it into English?
I think I have to be on the French channel.
Oh, okay.
You just want to copy and paste it into Skype, Alyssa?
Yeah.
And I can.
Okay, I do that. Yep. Okay. Go ahead, Isabel.
Yes, while we do that, we just have a last comment or recommendation in case you want to react to it. It's from Rochelle as well. It says, if this curriculum can have one more module on PSEA and safeguarding, as this is the most required intervention in all emergency programs, especially when cash is involved in food security program design.
Yeah, that's a great recommendation, and also something that we discussed tirelessly amongst ourselves. I think we decided to, I agree with you. Yeah, and definitely that's a great recommendation for Mercy Corps, maybe moving forward if they want to do an add-on module. And this is, any opinion that I'm stating is an individual consultant opinion. It's not the opinion of Mercy Corps, and maybe Sahar has an idea on this, or Alyssa or Maimuna. But for me, the safeguarding and protection mainstreaming sphere of emergency and humanitarian context often gets convoluted with gender and GESI. And to me, they're very distinct and very different and 100% super related. And a lot of times I think the PSEA kind of analyses that would go into an emergency type of situational analysis is totally crucial and needs to be done. And there's opportunity to integrate into those processes more GESI specific questions. So yes, but I also think they're very distinct, if that makes sense. So, and I'm frequently hesitant to combine them because there is so much combining that I feel like they get combined to the fault where like one of them or both of them maybe gets lost. But I really appreciate that, because that is obviously something we discussed a lot, and I would appreciate any additional thoughts on that. I don't know, Alyssa or Sahar, Maimuna, what you're thinking about that as well. If you have anything to add on that really excellent and difficult question.
It is a very excellent. Go ahead, Sahar.
I was just going to say thank you. I think it's a great question, and I really appreciate and agree with Laura's response. I will say that this curriculum was developed as a part of an ideal grant, and that grant is ending. So any additions that we make to the curriculum, we would need to think about when and how to do that from the resource perspective, as well as I think that there will be opportunities to continue to improve and adapt. And I appreciate the suggestion. We'll certainly take it under advisement. But I do agree with Laura, certainly in the way that Mercy Corps is structured, like just internally for us, the team that focuses on PSEA is slightly different from the GESI team. And so it's even a different group of people in our structure who are focusing on the topic. And so that may not be the case for of course, the way that all of our colleagues are structured. So yeah, we'll definitely consider the suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, great. And really good question. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I saw Martin's question, Alyssa, and I'll get to you individually. I think it's more of an individual question versus a group question. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
We don't have any more questions on the chat, so we can continue with that.
Perfect. That's perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate everyone joining today. I know that it's all different time zones. As a quick follow-up, again, this was recorded, and I will probably be sharing it out with the participants for those who missed it, but also just be on the lookout for all the resources that we're going to be sharing. Again, once they hit the Food Security Network, please reach out to Maimuna or myself or Sahar or Laura for questions that you have that are more in depth, and for just taking a peek at the curriculum so that it can be useful for everyone. We really want to make sure that this is a useful curriculum and that it's used and not just kind of left in the dust. So that's all I have to say. Thank you so much for everyone for participating, and have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thanks, Melissa. Thank you, everybody.